Ultimately, David ruled over Israel for 40 years, and upon his death, his son Solomon assumed the royal throne, where he too ruled for 40 years. Now, in the early days, Solomon was a great king who accomplished a lot of really good stuff for Israel. It was he who built the temple in Jerusalem, and he was credited with being a really good and wise king. That is, until he wasn't. It seems that Solomon had a weakness for women, and the whole time that he was building up his kingdom, he was also building up his harem to the tune of 700 wives and 300 concubines. The wives were all of royal blood from other lands, who each had their own gods, and despite the fact that Solomon had promised fidelity to Yahweh, before he knew it, there he was worshiping these other gods. Now, God had been making it clear all along to each and every ruler that as long as they remained faithful and upheld the covenant, they would be blessed and the kingdom would flourish. But if they disobeyed and went their own ways, then they would suffer all sorts of consequences. The consequences for Solomon were that the kingdom was eventually divided, and after nearly 80 years of peace, Israel became filled with conflict and corrupt leaders. After Solomon, it seemed that each king was progressively more crooked than the last, until finally along comes Ahab, who the text accuses of doing more evil in the sight of the Lord than all who were before him. Now, this is saying quite a lot, given the ethics of some of the previous kings, but the title was, in fact, well earned. Ahab married Jezebel of Phoenicia, and together these two were ruthless. Like the time Jezebel had a vineyard owner falsely accused and murdered simply because Ahab wanted to expand his gardens, which were right next to the vineyard. To make matters worse, Phoenicians worshiped the god Baal, and Jezebel was highly devoted to this practice. Worship of Baal involved brutal child sacrifices and extremely explicit sexual rites. It was not exactly a consciousness-expanding religion, but it did suit the bloodlust of Jezebel, who demanded that the worship of Yahweh be abolished in favor of Baal. Ahab supported her demands, so God sent in a prophet, a man of faith, named Elijah, to confront Ahab and to call the people back to faithfulness. Well, of course, it's risky business speaking truth to corrupt power, so once the message is delivered, God sends Elijah to another region that is considered enemy territory. He's separated from family and friends and all the things that were familiar. And not only that, he has to depend on the birds to feed him. Elijah has most definitely been removed from his comfort zone. Today's story is actually 3 stories about God's provision. First, there is Elijah in the desert being fed by ravens. Then there's the widow with the jar of oil that's about to run out. And finally, the widow's son who dies but is miraculously brought back to life by Elijah. In all 3 stories, Elijah trusts God, but he has to live on the edge of that trust, depending on God, and knowing that when something else happens, God will once again come through. That is a mighty tough place to be in, isn't it? I mean, let's face it, it's a whole lot easier to talk about trusting God's provision in the face of despair than it is to live in it. And truth be told, it's not very easy to preach about it either, because faithful people do starve. Faithful people do dehydrate, and sometimes it seems as though God is nowhere to be found in the middle of all that. I cannot say to you in good conscience that stories like this prove that all you have to do is trust in God and all of your needs will be met, because things happen. Disasters occur, and evil is real. But you see, the purpose of this story, or any biblical story, is not to promise prosperity if we just have faith. What's at play here are actually the broad brushstrokes of a much bigger picture. Have you noticed an emerging pattern as we've read through these stories? Things that happen over and over again. Have you noticed how these stories often reveal important truths about God and us? Have you noticed how often the characters in these stories are forced to let go of what's familiar in order to embrace a deeper trust in God? Since we began our narrative journey, Adam and Eve left the garden to make their way in the world. Abraham and Sarah left their home to journey toward a land that they knew absolutely nothing about. Jacob had to leave his home in order to escape the wrath of Esau. Joseph was forced into slavery in Egypt. Moses had to leave the safety of his pastures to go up against Pharaoh. And the Israelites left the familiarity of Egyptian slavery to wander through the wilderness. In every story, someone had to leave behind what was familiar so that they could find themselves in God's hands in a way that deepened their faith. And why does this pattern get repeated over and over again in the biblical story? Because this is the pivotal point in any faith journey. This same pattern is just as true for us today as at any point in history, because it is only when we have come to the end of ourselves that God meets us most profoundly. It's only when we have absolutely nothing left to hold on to that we discover that we do not fall, because we are held in the hands of a God who is faithful and able to provide. Jesus put it so beautifully in the first beatitude. He said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." But I like Eugene Peterson's translation much better in the Message, which reads, "You're blessed when you're at the end of your rope. With less of you, there is more of God and his rule." This is the truth that those in recovery know so well. More often than not, it isn't until people hit rock bottom, when they come to the very end of themselves, that they open up to the transforming power of God to heal them. This is the truth that exemplifies my own faith journey so well. Not long before I felt myself being called to ministry, I lost someone I loved, someone that I was engaged to, and the death of this person truly brought me to the end of myself. I felt as though my whole world had collapsed and nothing was familiar anymore. I felt like I had nothing to hang on to, and like there was this big gaping hole inside of my heart. But it was there that God met me and filled me with a peace that was beyond my ability to understand. Since then, my life has been about letting go. Not just people, places, and things, but ideas about myself and who it is that I think that I am. It helps us to think about our lives as being drawers full of stuff. I have this special drawer at home that seems to magically fill up with the most useless assortment of stuff imaginable. Into that drawer go all of the extra parts left over from things that I've put together. Broken things that I intend to fix someday. Decks of cards, pens that don't write, extra Christmas light bulbs, locks without keys, keys without locks, dried up bottles of glue. Does anybody else have one of these special drawers? I see some heads nodding. Everything that goes into this drawer always seems like it's still useful, or it's something that I just can't seem to let go of for one reason or another. Maybe I'll need it someday, or maybe it reminds me of something or someone. It's just stuff, but it's stuff that I'm familiar with. stuff that I've hung on to for years, stuff that kind of makes me feel good and secure. So this drawer is my life, full of stuff. Now, I want more faith, more trust in God. There's no more room for faith. My drawer is full of stuff that I've always trusted to keep me comfortable and secure. But if I really want more faith, more trust in God, then what do I have to do? I have to clear out my drawer to make some room. It sounds easy enough when it's a drawer full of odds and ends, but when it's an entire lifetime's accumulation of things that make us feel safe and comfortable, well, that's another matter entirely. Reflecting on my own life, it seems to me that there have been times when I have chosen to clear out the drawer, and other times that drawer has been dumped out for me. Either way, though, what I have found is that when I let go of what's familiar, when I come to the end of my rope, God is always there in ways that deepen my faith. Do y'all realize that on Tuesday, I will have been your pastor for 2 years? 2 years. And as I reflect on this last 2 years, I can remember a lot of times when our collective drawer seemed kind of empty. The dissolution of the yoke, budgeting for a full-time pastor, the loss of some of our congregation. But looking back now, I can see that it was during those times that God was shaping all of us for a deeper trust. And speaking for myself, had things been easy, I doubt that I would have grown as much as I have. Unlikely heroes like Abraham and Joseph and David and Elijah had to let go of the familiar and the comfortable. And when they did, when they came to the end of themselves, they discovered that God would never let them go. Those experiences shaped them and deepened their faith, and that same pattern is true for unlikely heroes like you and me. But it is it's not an easy journey, but it is a necessary journey if we truly, in fact, want to grow. In today's reading, verse 16 says that the jar of meal was not emptied, neither did the jug of oil fail, according to the word of the Lord that he spoke by Elijah. The widow emptied her already empty drawer, and God provided more. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense in our world today, but I have found it to be true in God's world. Life is full of edges. Life is filled with suffering and disappointment. Life is filled with loss and confusion. But that is when God does God's finest work by turning all of our crucifixions into resurrections. Look at Jesus, who emptied himself completely. Look at it in Jesus. Believe in it in Jesus. Admire it in Jesus. Love it in Jesus. And let it take shape in your own soul. This is how we are transformed and healed. And this is how we give and receive hope. Amen. And so now is that time when you get to choose the next song.